Hello and welcome to the Glad You Knew Politics Podcast. I'm Reese Ryan, and here with me is political science superstar Nathan Ang. This week, our special guest is Giovanni Peri from the University of California, Davis, who is an economist who is an expert on the economics of immigration.
Reese, you really made it tough for us by scheduling this chat with Giovanni at 7 a.m, but boy, was it worth getting out of bed for. There are so many common narratives and misconceptions when we talk about or hear about immigration in the news, and that's why it was absolutely fantastic to talk about what immigration really is, how immigrants really benefit the countries they move to, and why the people who are seemingly most against immigration might actually benefit from it. As countries around the world like Australia and the United States have benefited from immigration, I think it's important to have a better conversation about immigration beyond immigrants as some sort of criminal or Donald Trump's border wall.
So right, Nathan. I couldn't have said it better myself. So, let's get stuck in with another Glad You Knew Politics Podcast. Giovanni, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, I find your story just amazing, how you ended up from Perugia to California. But when you were younger, did you always imagine yourself looking into immigration?
So when I was a little kid, no, I was born in Perugia, as you said, in this very small town in central Italy. Then I moved to Milan, which is a bigger town in northern Italy. That's where I studied. And then after college, I came to the US to do a PhD at UC Berkeley. Actually, between college and when I came in the US, I spent 1 year doing a civil service, which was a substitute of the military service back then. And during this year, I worked in a center for immigrants to Italy. At that time was 1993, were mainly Eastern European, Albanian, North Africans. And that's where I really started getting interested. And I would say the first impression was that these people were amazing, were really interesting people, really motivated people. And at the same time, the Italian press and the Italian public was talking about the risk of immigration. These were the first waves, how potentially concerning they were. And so I saw the disconnect and I thought, let me study this a little bit more. And then I did my PhD in economics. And eventually I settled to really focus on the economics of migration, which has become my specialty. And now that's what I teach and that's what I do for my research.
I find it very interesting that the word immigration, growing up, and that's how you hear about it. When we're growing up and we're hearing about it in politics and in the news, immigration seems to be this kind of dirty word in a way. It's associated with a certain kind of people, or you get a certain kind of imagination of immigration. Can you help us define and set out what we mean by immigration here?
Yes, so you're very right. I think when you listen to the media and we hear the discourse, when people talk about immigration and immigrants, they always do this connected to images of people on a boat who are a bit desperate, people who are very vulnerable at the border. Immigration is that too, but is so much more than that. So in a very simple way to define immigration, immigrants are people who reside and live for a significant part of their life in a different country than where they were born. That's the definition that economists use, and it's very simple. Somebody who has moved from where they were born somewhere. But I think it's useful to define also a little bit some different categories, if you want, of immigrants, because they help us sometimes also to talk about different aspects of immigration. So one distinction which is done quite often is between temporary and permanent immigrants, meaning some people who stay for a period in a country and then go back, and people who then spend their whole life in the other country. Temporary immigrants are typically people who go for study reason, for work reason, but they only stay a limited amount of time. This is very well defined in most countries' visa system. There are some visas that only allow you to be in a country for a little while, and others that allow you to be permanently in a country. But from an economist point of view, the distinction definition is a little bit more blurred. There are some people who go in a place to just stay for a while and they end up living there. I mean, I think my case is one of those. I came to the US to study. I wanted to get a PhD and go back to Italy and teach. Then I met my wife, then I had kids, and then it became more complicated to live. And now I have been here for 25 years, and maybe I am a permanent immigrant. Another category, another distinction which is made, which I think is more interesting, is the reason for migration. So migrants are divided into economic migrants, so people who move for professional, economic, even study is considered sort of an economic migrant. Family reason, people who move because their spouse, their mother, their father, their close relative is in a country. And then people who move for reason which they don't choose. So refugees, displaced people, people who have to move out of their own country because of wars or extreme event. These are three groups which often sort of are discussed and are referred to. And finally, I would say economists also tend to do a little bit of distinction. This is more have to do with jobs and labor market opportunity between less educated or less skilled migrant and highly educated and highly skilled migrant. So people who come to be what we call laborer or workers versus professional and other. Those are definitions, a sort of way of grouping migrants. But as you see, migration is a very complex and very large, involves a very large number of people, while people, when they discuss, they tend to really focus on a segment sometimes of this. And that's why sometimes immigration is, for instance, I very rarely am referred to as an immigrant, or here is an immigrant. They say here is a professor, here is a, but the person who lives in California and maybe comes from Mexico and work for a farm worker often is referred as an immigrant. And so that creates a little bit this distinction.
And lucky you did meet your wife, because we wouldn't probably have met you through the University of California.
I am lucky that I met you, my wife. You're right about that. I don't know if she is, but I was
we haven't got her on the phone to ask her that question, so we're going to say yes.
I'll ask for you. I'll ask for you when she listens to the podcast.
Oh, thanks, Giovanni. Grazie mille. Before we get stuck into the research and what you've covered over the last couple of years, how do you deal with the stigma that people have of immigration? I know that may seem simplistic, but I find it really hard that people do have those views. How do you see it when you're living your normal life and you hear people say these things on social media that are very negative towards people who do move to another country?
So my approach, maybe a little bit because professionally I'm a teacher, I am a professor, is always that of trying to educate people rather than oppose them or criticize. I think that a lot of the stigma, and in particular of the stereotypical views of immigrants, come really from a lack of knowledge of who the immigrants are, of their stories, of their personal experience, and a lack of knowledge also of the basic facts and statistics, how much they contribute, what's their value. So my attitude is always that of engaging into say, let's learn a little bit more about that. Let me tell you a little bit about this. I have to say that in the United States and in many countries, Australia, I'm sure in part too, there are really a little bit two narratives that you hear. On one end, for sure, there is this one of they are coming here, they are ruining our culture, they are different from us. However, there is also a narrative that says that the US is a country built on immigrants. Our grandparents of many people who are here were immigrants. They went through a lot of... Australia is the same. They went through a lot of sacrifice to build a great life. So there is also a little bit of a view of migrant which is extremely positive. So my attempt is always that to move from the negative to the positive narrative. And often when you hear the story of migrants, when you really, rather than imagining what they do, you experience who they are and you hear what they have done, I think a lot of this contributes. So for me, more information, more knowledge about this is going to be a little bit of a good medicine to reduce this level of stereotypical view and sometimes of negative views, which however is there for sure.
It just feels like, yeah, you're right. There is two narratives that are always going on. The one about the immigrants coming to steal your jobs and they're flooding in. And I'm sure in America with the wall, from Mexico, they're coming by all the vans and they're coming up and they've got gangs and criminals. But on the other hand, you've got that narrative of we're built by this, and it's usually when they want to just praise themselves as look at us, we're doing very well. But at the same time, they have all these policies about in Trump with the wall, and Australia is about stopping the boats because no one can get to us unless it's by a boat.
Right. And also, interestingly enough, Nathan, there has always been this other aspect of the two narrative, which is the old immigrants were really good, but the new immigrants are of a different type, and the old were legal, the new are illegal. And this has happened in the United States when, the Italian and the Irish replaced the German immigrant who had come before. And so they were Southern or different. And then when the Latin and Asian immigrant replaced the European, always say, but I think that if you look at the data, you instead note a lot of similarities between these experiences. And so, one way again is to say, no, look, it's not that your grandparents who came here were very different from the Mexican and the Chinese who are coming now. They were motivated by the same thing, and they're going to do the same, have the same kind of impact on this country.
I think the kind of the human condition of migration and trying to find like a better life is, common and mutual across all of these groups. And it reminds me of this Australian politician. It's Jackie Lambie. No, was it Jackie Lambert? No, the one that's really racist from Queensland. Pauline Hanson. Yeah, back 20 years ago, she was rallying against the Chinese immigrants, the Vietnamese especially, and how they're, a danger to our Australian society. But then now, 20 years later, she's shifted gears and gone, it's the Muslims.
Exactly. Yes. Interestingly enough, there are some incredibly anti-immigration politicians currently in the US who are Italian-Irish origin. So just one generation, removed from immigration, some become nativists. So that's a phenomenon that happens.
It's so incredible just to see this play out when you know the history, and it's right. Incredible. Going to your research, you believe that immigration is a key social engine of economic and social growth in countries where they move, when migration happens. What does this mean, and why is that the case?
So, going back to the picture that I was painting of how differentiated and how broad is the immigration phenomenon, immigrants are many things in the country where they go for the host country. So in the United States, I have a lot of research showing how immigrants have a crucial role in two parts of the economy of the US. A group of immigrants are this relatively low-educated manual worker, and they're very important because they are key for some sector like agricultural, construction, personal services, restaurant services, in doing some type of jobs that native are moving out of very quickly because they are more getting better education, they're aging. And so some of these sector really have these workers who are immigrant, and thanks to them can expand the whole sector and all the companies working there hiring also American. And then there is another group, which are the highly educated scientists and engineers. This group too has a lot of immigrants in the US. These are the innovator, people who are in science and technology. They contribute to productivity in the US, to growth of firm, and through that, to growth of the whole economy. Immigrants are also important entrepreneurs. There is a higher entrepreneurial rate among immigrants and natives, means they start company, they start firms, so they give jobs to Americans in this case, or native. In Silicon Valley, which is famous in the world for driving information technology, more than half of the companies have been started by immigrants, and more than 60% of the PhD working there are immigrants. Immigrants are also important consumers in the country where they go, so they stimulate demand. Some sectors of the United States deeply depend on quote-unquote immigrants. So think about the higher education sector, for instance, the universities in the US. And this is true for Australia too, in a huge amount. They educate a lot of foreign students, they hire a lot of foreign professors, and they are one of the most successful quote-unquote export of the US. Educational services are really paid by Chinese and Indian and Middle Easterner and European coming. So they also contribute that way. Immigrants generate connections between company and firms in the US and their country of origin, increasing the export of this. There is a lot of research that show that companies that hire immigrants are also more successful in exporting in their country of origin and in investing in their country of origin. Immigrant transfer and generate technology and innovation, especially those highly educated. So as you see, many aspects of the economy are touched and affected by immigrant, and there is no doubt that the US economy, the Canadian economy, the UK economy, the Australian economy, I'm mentioning this because our country, all with significant share of immigrants, have been driven and have grown in important part because of contribution of immigrants. Just to give you an idea, in a paper that we wrote, in a study that we did, we estimate that half of the economic growth in the last 30 years in the US is due to innovation and contribution that immigrants have brought to the US. So a very large part of the success of the US through the fact that immigrants, as I said, have idea, innovate, but also consume, generate, create companies. This is a very big and important impact.
That's huge. I don't know about you, Nave, but there seems like there's so many positives for immigration, and I absolutely love that we've almost got Michelangelo on the show. You're painting such a picture this morning for us. Giovanni.
Thank you. Well, no, I'm no painter in reality. I'm just with words.
You forgot political scientists among the bracket of educated immigrants that are contributing, not just the engineers right. and the scientists.
That's true. There are all over. I mean, in my department, half of the people are immigrants, and in the university where I teach, 35% are. So massive numbers.
So then why do people have a drawback with immigration?
So let me say a couple of things, maybe before directly going to that. So immigration also implies significant changes in the economy and in the society that goes. So it's not that it comes with a completely generalized and only a gain for all. In some particular area and sector, there could be people that for instance, have some competition from foreign workers, and they need to, update their skill, change. Interesting, we see that in most cases, people don't lose job because of immigrant, but they have to change what they do, adjust what they do. But I think that so economically, there are some adjustment, and there may be some cost, short-term cost in particular, because companies have to adapt, they have to expand. Economically, though, most of the research is about these long-term gains and maybe some small short-term losses. But I think that what really drives a lot of the anti-immigration sentiment is this impact on changing some of the culture, some of the look of the cities, some of the, in a neighborhood that used to be only local, now there are, it looks more Mexican, it looks more Chinese. And although I think that in many respects this is an incredible enrichment of the local culture, some people fear. So there is, and this is genuine, a sentiment among some people, and I'm happy then to discuss who this group is, among some people that immigrants sort of are a danger to the culture, to the habits, to the current way of living of a country. And in this, again, I have analyzed, and I'm happy to talk more in detail, but I have analyzed how political vote and political sentiment has evolved. But economic is not driven by the economic consequences of immigration. It's mostly driven by this cultural potential threat. And even this, though, and I'm happy to talk more, even this seems to be driven more by lack of knowledge than knowing who and what the immigrants are.
I find it so sad, though, Giovanni, that the people use those sentiments that they don't fit the culture, because Nathan's originally born in Singapore, but as he said in an earlier podcast, he feels Australian. You would almost feel American. why isn't that way or that sentiment or that belief that we all are Australian, we all are American, and even though we've come from somewhere, this is our home?
I will go one step further. Not only I feel American, and I am definitely, for many respects, I feel even more American. In a sense, my choice to be American came from the fact that I really was motivated to come. I really was fascinated by the possibility that this country offered, by the dream. But I also, on the other hand, add a little bit of different things and colors, as you said, to the American if we were all, in California, all born in California, raised, I bring in a little bit better knowledge of soccer. I can train my kids. I bring a little bit of a different way of cooking that people like. So not only I feel American, but I also add to the diversity and the differences of, talent that this place has, which I think is a positive thing. And this is where the economists, I think, emphasize these varieties and different. There is gain in variety of skills when you work, in varieties of abilities when you do a job, but also in varieties of idea when you attack a problem, in varieties of approach and point of view when you tackle either a technical problem or a social problem. And so, yes, I agree with you. Not only we all contribute, but we contribute with the little thing that makes us unique. And we are more unique because we come from different places. And so I think that's the core of the contribution and of the positive effect that immigrants bring. And we just need to have more people see that. I think a lot of people do, but not everybody.
I love the quote from Francesco Totti. The home is where the heart is. It's the only quote I've ever lived by from Francesco Totti.
Italian soccer very well, Rice. I assume you have a favorite team there, or you're following
I've been all across Italia watching football, so I absolutely love it. Love the game.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
I just love the food, so I love the football as well. But
that's good. Well, we already touched the three of the big things: the art, Michelangelo, the food, and the soccer. So those are all contributions to
I've actually been to Perugia as well.
Oh wow, that's amazing! Yeah. Beautiful town, isn't it?
It's amazing. Yeah, my parents and I we stayed there a night. So great spot.
That's wonderful.
The food though, I was a little bit pregnant though when I did jump on the plane back to Australia.
Oh wow! Yes, I know that's the risk. The risk is to overdo it.
When we're talking about immigrants from all these countries, used to be the Irish and the Italians, and now it's people from China, the Africans, or the Middle East. Do you think you talk about the scale of change? Do you think it's got to do maybe in a way about social capital, where it's like if an Italian moved to my all-white neighborhood, I would go, it's that Italian. So like, they're bringing, you would imagine like gelato, pizza. It's like, it feels good. But if you think of maybe someone from the Middle East moving to your town, and you kind of think of not so good things in a way, like you can't really pinpoint to a specific food that's very popular. In movies, they're always the terrorists. And then you think of big historical events, you just think, 9/11 and all these ISIS, and it's never always the best images that are portrayed, especially in Western countries like Australia and the US.
So, yes, you raised 2 points, and here I want to be very careful because they're delicate and important. One is Italians have not always been so enjoying such a positive image and so welcome in many of the countries where they have gone. In the early 1900s, the immigration of Italians in the US was associated with Italians being anarchist and bringing some risk of communism, being mafia related. And there were a lot of Italians who were discriminated and tried sometimes because of their supposed connection with mafia, some unjustly. So things change. And now you're right, Italians has become more fashionable. I mean, you point out every country, if you look in the history of the country, has so much to give. I mean, the Middle East is the reason why we have mathematics, why we have astronomy. They have developed sciences when the West was closed and rather conservative the Arab thinkers were driving the world. But then, of course, there are also things which are, the events which may make people more averse to that. I actually think in general that there is always a good reason if you want to look for excluding people, if you want to point out the differences. And there are always very good reason to find people incredibly positive and bringing good. You're right that now, in the US, most of the discrimination now in terms of immigrants is towards Mexican, towards maybe Arab in Australia this way too, and not towards European, because the history has changed. I still think, though, that all I said in terms of richness and enriching the economy, this is true for all of these groups. They all bring their own skills. And there are some groups which are closer culturally and other more distant. And there is research that says the cultural distance, in a way, is a hurdle. So one other thing that I would say in terms of immigration, if you think of maybe if there are the costs, is that it takes a while also for the immigrant to integrate and assimilate in a society. And so maybe a progressive and a slow growth of immigration is better than a sudden opening and expansion, just because it takes a little bit of time for local to absorb and get used to that. But I would say that definitely we should want immigration to be diverse, to be for all people, have people in the world, and the more varied they are, the better the society will be.
So time's almost the big healer with immigration.
In part, yes, because the immigrant of yesterday then become assimilated and it becomes the citizen of today. So there needs to be some times. It is true that countries have differed in their ability of really absorbing immigrants. So, for instance, the US, as much as there is a current, this current sentiment, is considered a country where immigrants after one generation are essentially integrated. So the kids of immigrant, that's as Nathan was saying before, the kids of Chinese and Mexican and Italian in the US, they really feel American. They still feel their heritage, but they feel fully American. And they, in terms of economic outcome, income, jobs that they do, education, they look like Americans, sometimes even better than Americans, the second generation. In other countries, this assimilation has been a little slower. Germany is, for instance, indicated as a country where the second generation is not done very well. Big immigration in Germany of Turks and Italian in the 1940s and 50s. Still the second generation of Turks, of Turkish people seems to have a hard time integrating. France also has some problem with the second generation of North African who has integrated less well. So time helps, but also the ability of a country to integrate economically and socially is important. And, what are the ingredients to make this work? Certainly having a job, being productive, and having education are very important component of this. But also an attitude from the local that allow you to do that is important.
So let's say you're advising, Germany on how they can better help the Turks to integrate, and, is there anything you would specifically say, or, you hear a lot of tropes about how all of these minority and immigrant communities it's just their culture, they're too inward and their culture is too different. They don't take the time to assimilate.
So there are some policy indications which I think are relatively simple and very important and should and in part have been taken. One, I would say, is how easy it is for an immigrant to get citizenship of the country where they go. In the US and in Australia and in Canada, if you're born in the country, you automatically have that citizenship. In Germany, it has not been so until very recently. So the second generation of Turkish people were not Germans until they were 18 years old. And so they always consider themselves as a guest. So this, many people say, will imply that both the family and the young person will not invest as much in their education in German, in learning really well, in getting all the skills, because they always thought, maybe I'll have to go back, or maybe I'm not a full citizen. So getting citizenship for people who stay and is important. Getting a job is very important, and having a career is really crucial. So the American labor market has worked relatively relatively well. It has been quite competitive and open, and people find jobs relatively easily. For a while, the German labor market has been quite regulated, quite sluggish. Again, recently there have been important reforms that have made Germany much more successful in creating job and integrating. So I would say having a job is very important. And the other, I would say, the education system of a country and evolving this education system from a system which is based on learning only about the culture that is local to learning and teaching more a broad view. And I can see in places, in many European countries, the teaching and education was very Eurocentric. And this also creates a sense that Europeans are at home and other people are guests. So certainly, sort of the status, the immigration status or the citizenship status, the access to jobs and the schooling are very important. Another policy which seems to be very important is the housing policy in the term of, do these people end up segregated in a part of town or integrated with the rest? Typically, in some, for historical reasons, in some cities, there is this strong segregation of immigrant created, and making immigrants able to access housing, outside of their area, so making the housing market a little bit more competitive, a little more open, is also another channel to integrate people in the receiving country. So these are concrete things on which you can remove some hurdle and make it easier. And then, of course, the cultural part is the one more complicated and more longer run. But I would say that adjusting the institutions and adjusting some of these policies will go a long way.
Hopefully it will go a long way, Giovanni. But I would love to ask you about the impact economically and the legal political immigration policies. But you've already made an impact on us this morning. We must tell the listeners, it is 7 a.m. in Australia, and just your energy and knowledge has really motivated us this morning.
I'm wide awake now.
I'm so glad to hear that.
not only now, but also on the immigration topic. I know more now.
I'm glad, especially with Zoom, that sometimes it's so hard to get people engaged, and it's always harder than doing it in person. But I'm so glad. It feels like you guys are here.
Yeah. So what is the economic and legal political immigration policies in the US, and what impact has that made on the economy?
Talking a little bit about the immigration policy of the US right now, the US has actually experienced in the last 10, 20 years a decline in immigration. And a decline because the immigration system there has been no reform of the system for 20 years. And the only real immigration program that has brought in a significant amount of people is this H-1B visa program, which is for skilled workers. But it's very constrained. And everybody was saying that the US needs to expand a little bit its immigration policy, and we should go towards more skilled immigrant. The other big problem that the immigration in the US has right now is this large number of undocumented immigrants who have worked in the United States for a decade or more, many of them who are part of the economy, but they're not fully part of society because they don't have a legal status. So policy affects a lot immigration. And on top of all this, in the last 3 years since the Trump administration, a sequence of very restrictive executive order mainly, so not law were not changed because the parliament has not done, but executive order of the president have made immigration even more restrictive. First, they have banned some countries from coming in, then they have halted the green cards, which are permanent resident, and then they have halted even the H-1B visa in this last period. In combination with COVID, of course, the emergency of COVID would have impacted immigration anyway. So I would say that right now, immigration in the US is very constrained relative to what it was even just 20 years ago, and has been declining. And the impact of this is that there are fewer of these skilled students, skilled workers, skilled foreigners coming in, and the growth of the US could slow down as a consequence of this. And certainly, I think that once COVID is the COVID issue is resolved, if the US does not adopt it a little bit more of an open immigration, or at least scales back and reverses some of the measure, immigration in the US will be significantly decreased. And this will, in the long run, have impact. The economy will grow less. One thing we have not discussed, which is also crucial, and I want to mention, is the demographic impact of immigration. All Western countries, US among them, but European countries even more, are actually having a population that is declining because the birth rate has dropped so much and is aging. So immigration, which typically involves young people coming in, will be a way of balancing the demographic structure, having more young people in the labor market, more people paying for social security, so for paying the pension of older people, and will allow a better sustainable economy. With this reduction in inflow of immigrants, also the demographic aging and the problem that this will entail on the labor market and on the pension system could become more serious. So I always think, and I hope that a reasonable but more expensive immigration policy is something that the next president will consider. Of course, if it's Donald Trump, my hopes are low.
Say the Santa Marias, Giovanni.
I know. I only pray. You're right. I'll have to hope from some help from above.
Might need a trip to the Vatican just to curry some favor there.
I don't know that the Vatican has much pull on that, but yeah, why not?
And when we talk about the demographics of the immigrants coming to help balance the aging population, how does that contribute? Because you touched on it a bit earlier, but how does it contribute to the kind of the backlash or how people vote?
So that's interesting. So who are the people who are more averse to immigration in a country? There are a few facts that seem well established. Younger people seems to be more open than older people. More educated people seems to be more open than less educated people. Urban people who live in cities and in urban environments seems to be more open than not. And if you have to look at a political spectrum, people who are more open to immigration seems to be more on the left side of the political spectrum rather than on the right. So let me be clear on this political classification. There are some extreme right party which have made anti-immigration their sort of trademark, their key issue. And there are parties like this in France, in Italy, and in many other places, in the UK. But even leaving aside these extreme groups, in general, there seems to be a little bit of a correlation. If a person says to be a little bit more left of the center, they tend to be a little bit more open in terms of immigration. So now, what is the hope for the future? Where are we going? Well, education, increasing education, which is something that is happening, should help. And also living in urban environment should make people a little bit more open. But clearly the Western society is also aging. So from that respect, the aging in terms of voting seems to be, aging is associated with this fear, this increased fear. I want to say one thing which is interesting. It's paradoxical a little bit that older people are the one who fear most, because from an economic point of view are clearly and by far the group that is going to gain the most. First, the pension system on which they will depend is going to be funded by immigrants. Second, many of the jobs that are opening up because our society is aging, in healthcare, in assistance of the elderly, in support of home, are the typical jobs that immigrants are staffing. So here you see a little bit sometimes the disconnect between the economy. Sometimes you can talk to an older person and this person will express to you that, this country is not the same anymore because immigrants are coming. But then this person will love the helper who is from the Philippines or from Mexico, who assists and takes care of the person. So sometimes there is this disconnect a little bit. And so, I would say that the natural tendency of a society which is aging is a society potentially that becomes more scared about opening to the rest of the world. But maybe a little bit of an offset will be, as I said, more education, the fact that young generation have been exposed to a more open type of environment. And I again would say that information, communication, the role of media. If the media keep hammering an image of immigrant which is associated with fear, with crime, and doesn't reflect the contribution, the positive, this also will have an impact. So this opinion can be changed, but I think there is work to do, and economists and social science people who study this need to talk about these things. It's important, and so it's great that you guys are doing it.
If we get you on a billboard, Giovanni, I'm sure we'll change the immigration view across America.
Oh my God, right? No, I wouldn't want that.
I was thinking that now we know why your true intentions of why you studied immigration is because you want to make sure that your pension is well funded and that you're well taken care of in your older days.
There is always an economic interest deep down that drives everything. Yeah. Well, sometimes people here, say, "Oh, you're an immigrant. Of course, you defend the immigrant in your work."
Or maybe Trump should have said, Mexico is kind of a code for immigrants. It's like Mexico isn't going to pay for the wall, but it's going to pay for your pension and your healthcare.
Yeah, that's right. That would sound good to people, but then you need to let the Mexican in. Otherwise, how do they do it?
Drawing on from what you said about these kind of parties, more on the fringes, but it seems to be, from the news and what you see, it seems to be growing and growing that these kind of extreme and far-right groups that are making anti-immigration policies, they are kind of their focus. I just found it very interesting from your article in the conversation where you wrote that while these parties have made immigration kind of a hallmark of their policy, it actually doesn't really help them if they carry out their policy because other people might vote for other parties now that kind of, in a way, this problem is solved for them, and so they no longer have to vote for them.
Yeah, I agree with you. We, in fact, wrote that in, appreciating the irony of the situation, and this one issue party, if they really succeed in closing immigration, are going to become zero issue party. And so, but I think more realistically, immigration is never going to go fully away. The point is how much, we want to allow this, and also how well or not we want to treat immigrants who are in a country. And not only this type of party want to limit a lot, but deep down, they also, for immigrants who are already in the country, they will want to not allow them to access the same resources and possibilities that a citizen have, so disadvantaging them. And this will be also, even if they don't have outside immigrant to worry about, I think there will be a kind of a bad policy on which they will focus. I think in general, though, also that you're right that in the last decade, maybe, and maybe even stronger, last 5 years, there has been this sentiment of anti-immigration which has grown. So I think I would consider the two high points or some high points of this, the Brexit referendum, in which the UK has decided to get out mainly for the election of Donald Trump, certainly, and the relatively good success of some of these parties in some Eastern European country, in Italy, the Northern League, in France, the Front National. So those are all been, but this opinion have had historical swings back and forth. So just like in the early 1800s, the US was, in the early 1900s, the US was very open a country to immigrant. And then the arrival of immigrant generated anti-immigration that after the recession of the 20s blocked it. Then after World War II, there was a swing towards more openness. And now it goes down. I would hope and think that the extreme trend towards anti-immigration may slow down or change for two reasons. One, I think England has realized what a mess Brexit is. They have not been able to achieve it then. So how sometimes populist, demagogical position are, easy to say, but then they create more problem than they solve. And I think the US has realized also how an incompetent administration can really affect deeply a lot of things in the country. So if these two countries swing back to a little bit more, open country, this can lead the world maybe to a more reasonable approach to immigration. So I hope in the next 10, 15 years, we can see a swing back if I would say the US and the UK will lead in the next election with a more moderate choice.
How fitting. Our next podcast is actually on Brexit, Giovanni, so thanks for leading us in there.
That's great. Yeah, very important issue to talk about. I'm glad that this is a little bit of a plug for that.
You can write it and let us know what you think about, what was right and what was wrong about what our next guest is going to say.
All right, I will make sure I listen, and then I will let you know. I will comment on it for you guys only.
That's fantastic. And when we talk about, the groups that are especially the whole anti-immigration views, as you said, usually you can there are characteristics to who these kind of voters are. Ironic, as you say, that these are the voters that would, in a way, kind of benefit from immigration, but they don't see it, or they.
Yes, and let me qualify
sorry,
this.
it's a very delicate topic.
Yeah, so this is going to a lot of people. So I want to emphasize what I was citing are statistical averages. So it's clear that there are a lot of older people who are very open about immigration, and there are a lot of younger people who are anti-immigrant. On average, though, there seems to be this systematic association between these sentiments. So I want to be very clear. It's not that all people by any means. I was quoting an example also that happened actually to me in Italy, and so but it's very small and not necessarily representative, but in general there is this association, and so and you can understand why. Like, older people become a little bit more afraid, I guess, because they have less control on what goes on, and they think that this could be one thing that is damaging. But I think, as I said, more information, more communication should help on that side.
Is there any other ways we can help, in a way, protect them, or we talk about education and more messaging out, but I'm wondering, how do we actually do it?
Yeah, so I mean, you're right. So we should protect them in the way that really matters. So for instance, how we manage our healthcare system, and having an efficient healthcare system that is accessible to many people. And for this, I speak particularly for the US, is, open. That's going to be one way in which we can make elderly people more reliant. Also, having a social security, a pension system that is sustainable, is supporting them. This is something which is very important. So passing policies that really, especially for the more vulnerable people who are aging, really support them is important. Finding an scapegoat for their fears into immigration is not the right approach. There are important policies in healthcare, in pension system, which are going to address some of their fears, and they are definitely something that we should get right. So in the US, in particular, I would say that sustaining a social security system, continuing to support Medicare system, which is for the elderly, is a very important part, rather than reducing them and scaling them down.
With your views, you're going to be forever young. Even the age, if you ever go to aged care, you're going to be telling everyone what's going on with immigration.
I will continue to tell people, yes, that we need more immigration even when I am very old. I agree with you.
Beautiful. Is it frustrating with all your research and all the work that you do on the topic of immigration that in your lifetime you'll probably not be able to solve this issue? Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed.
Wow. Yeah, I have never dreamed of really solving the problem, to tell you the truth. What is a little bit frustrating sometimes is how, just in the time that I have been in the US, I think how much the federal administration has been listening to research like mine or similar to mine has gone down. And I would say that, I had big hopes, in fact, during the Obama administration, that some of these reforms were passed. And even that administration was a little bit more sluggish than I would have hoped, in order to go for a real immigration plan of, solving the undocumented, fixing some of these issues of restricted immigration. But then with the Trump administration, clearly the voice of research and facts have become completely marginalized in the debate. That is frustrating a little bit. The fact that I have to repeat these things many times is actually sometimes exciting, because I find some new people who have not heard about this, who think, they're reasonable, they're real. So the idea that, and what excites me the most is my students that come in and they seem to be very receptive, and my graduate students who are also going to do research on this, and they're going to give their contribution. So you're right, I've not solved the problem, but my contribution, much more limited, is I have contributed to create here a center for studying immigration, which is becoming important. I have contributed to educate undergraduate, graduate students who are very sensitive to this, and they're going to have important roles. So this gives me at least a little bit of comfort in a general depressing state. I agree.
For you, like, you create the center at the university to help, and you're so glad to see more students who haven't heard about this. And when you heard about it, obviously you learn it and you become more aware. But I just find it kind of also amazing that for one group where, you see this as education and building awareness, Trump would say that you're just indoctrinating a whole new generation with these Marxist and communist ideas. It seems to be along the lines of, when they talk about, seems to be politics in general these days, that where they, as well as in immigration, I see some parallels where they don't like this topic in general, and so they kind of throw all of the buzzwords at you that sound bad, like gangs, mafia, communists, socialists, the Soviet Union, Venezuela. It's all these buzzwords that make it sound the most horrible thing in the world.
Yes, so I agree. There are people who don't like. I want to hope and think that many of the people that I have met in California in my professional life, and I mean, again, California, even in terms of government, local is different actually from this attitude. I've had a lot of people who listen and a lot of people who are convinced. Unfortunately, immigration is something on which the policy authority is really at the federal level. California doesn't have very much, but we can still do a lot of good things for the local immigrant. I love also being involved at a little bit more local level. Sometimes you make a difference talking to people, knowing people, educating and mentoring local people. So sometimes I think that even if I can have a group of students who feel different because of that, and I can mentor, that's sometimes good enough. And sometimes you need the local just besides the global. So I would say that every time I turn on the TV and I hear the administration, that's when I get all the negative feeling. But every time I go into my class and I talk to my student, and every time I talk to my colleagues that do research, that's when I get my positive energy. And that has been enough to get me moving in the end. And I'm happy that it's like this.
We're glad you've shared all that passion for immigration with us this morning. But before Nathan starts singing Andrea Bocelli, Con te partirò, time to say goodbye, what would you be glad people knew with immigration, if there was something on your mind?
So the thing that I would like people to do with immigration is to admit that most of them don't know much, and that it's good to learn and listen to people, experiences and people who have done. And the one thing that I want to leave is, before dismissing it, really look at some of the immigrant experience and look at some of the research and the books on economic value of immigrants. That would be a good engine. You never know everything about something, but you should always have this curiosity and incentive to learn more. Only when you learn, you feel like you can talk about it. And a lot of people yell a lot, but they don't know a lot. I want people to know.
It sounds like you're asking for to solve a tougher problem than immigration, asking people to both admit that they are wrong and to look at books to study economic value. That sounds like a bigger mission than actually solving immigration itself.
Maybe it is. Maybe you're right. So maybe I should have a fallback option, which is, guys, just don't be so mean, and let's try to talk about these issues a little bit more frequently.
Oh, well. That wraps up. Nathan, would you like to say anything else, or?
No, it's been such an incredible chat. I've learned so much, and I hope others have learned just as much as I have.
Thank you. I was waiting for the Bocelli song, though.
It's too early. My vocal cords haven't warmed up yet, so maybe next time when you come back on.
Forget about Nessa and Dorma. I'm going back to sleep.
Wow, fair enough. I have to say, Rice, you have treated me with all your Italian and Italian opera and singer and cooking, so I feel honored that you have done such an homage to my original culture. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you for listening to the Glad You Knew Politics Podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a rating and a review on what you thought about this week's episode, and any other questions you might have or issues you would like us to cover in future episodes. You can keep up to date with us and the podcast by following us at Glad You Knew on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Links are in the description below.